Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Hey, all you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. On Good Friday, I attended my first ever Stations of the Cross service at an utterly gorgeous Roman Catholic church. A cadre of folks led by a priest paraded around the church's interior, the perimeter of the church, and they stopped at each of the 14 Stations of the Cross, and they would read scriptures from the gospel and the epistles, and those were verses pertaining to Jesus' arrest and passion and crucifixion and entombment. And then we would pray and sing a little chorus, a little hymn about Jesus being on the cross. And then they'd move to the next station. And it was just beautiful. The rest of the 400 of us who were there that midday on Friday, we followed the lead of the priestly march around the church's perimeter. And like them, we knelt and prayed and read scripture with the leaders, and it was just an amazing service. It was a Good Friday service. But now we live in Easter time. The resurrection is God's yes to life, and more even eternal life. The resurrection is God's yes to his creation. Because Jesus bodily rose from the tomb, God will one day raise creation up to become something more than it is right now. My body is going to be resurrected and become both what it is and more than what it is one day after the pattern of Christ's own resurrection. It's all extraordinary. So happy Easter, everyone. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. This is the 6th episode thus far in a series on Christianity and sexuality. And before I get into today's topic, I want to pause and note that yes, you are right. You are right that I've not been doing thank you shout outs or support me plugs or hey, here's what's going on kind of info messages. Those omissions are all intentional. I still do have many folks to personally thank, but I thought, these episodes on sexuality are so important and so wrought with the potential for emotional misunderstanding that I've just decided to record these episodes without those shout outs or the like. And my hunch is that some people wouldn't want to be named in a sensitive episode about sexuality, and then also, for the same reason, I've hardly done any jokes. I mean, a few episodes I sang that famous song, Now Jesus is a Jew, which undoubtedly you find yourself singing around the house. But I've mostly toned down the extraneous stuff. And again, no, I haven't forgotten you or your financial gift or your prayers for me. By the way, thank you dearly for any and all prayers that you've prayed for me and for the show. It's just, again, that I want to focus on an important topic. So, the fact is, you guys, that among theists and Christians of different stripes, there's a widespread assumption about homosexuality. And it goes like this: people choose to be homosexual. It just must be the case at some point in their lives people chose to become homosexual. And what I want you to know is that please, 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 that is almost entirely untrue. Today I want you to think with me about the matter in a more careful, accurate, and nuanced way. And just so you know my reasoning, my motives are both as a truth seeker and as a minister. I want both truth and grace. If we assume that all people who are homosexual chose to be so, we will very likely be bearing false witness against them, and false witness creates stereotypes, and stereotypes engender ill will. And I don't know about you, but I think there's just too much ill will in society. let alone on the part of Christians. So come and think with me today, but come and let's be careful and let's be intentional in our thinking. There's too much sloppy thinking that takes place, and like I say, I want to be more careful than that. And the first thing I want to note as we think through what are the contributing factors to homosexuality, the first thing noteworthy is that there is no genetic cause. I remember a few decades ago there was some claim to genetic causation, and I was looking online to find when that happened, and the Daily Beast, and I'm citing the Daily Beast on this because it's known to veer hard toward the secular. But the Daily Beast reports that in, quote, in 1993, geneticist Dean Hamer published a paper in Science magazine that claimed that genetic markers on the X chromosome could influence the development of a same-sex orientation in men. This was the start of a long love affair between Hamer and the media in the 1990s, with news stories swirling around each of his successive publications in anticipation of the discovery of the mythical gay gene. End quote. In fact, the Daily Beast goes on to note the skepticism at work now inside the gay community itself. Quote, the popular media, once so easily convinced that homosexuality resulted from brain size and that homosexuality was genetic, promptly changed its tune to declare that homosexuality was now epigenetic, which concerns the switching on and off of genes. Hooray! If it's hard to get excited about these studies, the Daily Beast says, it's because at this point, biological explanations for homosexuality are like iPhones. A new one comes out every year. And besides, the studies that do enjoy widespread media circulation focus on a very narrow segment of the LGBT community, gay men. Information on the potential genetics of lesbianism is much harder to come by, and bisexual people, who constitute more than 50% of the LGBT community in the U.S., are rarely mentioned in the conversation about the genetics of sexual orientation. Again, this is the Daily Beast going on. Even if a conclusive link is found between genetic markers and male homosexuality, that still leaves most of the queer community unaccounted for. Finding that conclusive link, however, seems unlikely given the track record of these studies. At every turn, their veracity has been cast into doubt by the scientific community. That's all quotations from the Daily Beast. And again, the fact is, scientists have not found a gene which can be attributed as the cause of homosexuality. And frankly, if evolution is at work in the human species, to whatever extent that homosexuality is significantly and directly genetic, its presence in the population would shrink from one generation to the next and would eventually disappear. It makes sense to me. Homosexuals don't have children. Homosexuals that do have heterosexual sex have far lower childbearing rates than heterosexuals. But the homosexual rate does not appear to be declining, so we know that it's not a genetic thing that's at work here. Instead, folks, what we have are contributing factors for homosexual behavior. And I'm going to say this throughout my episode today. Please know these are contributing factors. None are direct causes. Scholars, psychiatrists particularly, have to work backward through interviews and data to find patterns, and those patterns begin to reveal factors that can lead to predilections, tendencies, proclivities, and biases in people's lives. But you will err today if you hear me saying any one or all of these factors are direct causes. It's just not the case. Human nature is far more elusive, far more difficult to pin down than any easily noted direct causations. So here are some contributing factors Number one, there are intrauterine effects, or sometimes they're called prenatal effects. This can involve things like hormones in the mom, stress and anxiety suffered by the mother, the chemicals she ingests, chemical addiction. These are all factors that pertain to something I call the temperature and climate of the oven, or I'll just talk about it as a matter of when we're in the oven, right? Babies are not born neutral. Not only are they determined by human ontology, nature, structure, being, the givenness, the fixedness of human existence, they are already shaped in utero. Some time ago, I read about a baby being born who was nervous, anxious, on edge, and she cried far more than a normal baby. And as it turns out, the mother herself during pregnancy had been nervous, anxious, and on edge about her own immediate family context during the entire pregnancy. That little zygote turned embryo turned fetus turned infant was being influenced, affected, shaped by the emotional and hormonal characteristics of her mother. Knowing that babies are shaped even in the oven, many moms refuse to drink alcohol or smoke or take certain medicines while they're pregnant. My own wife, Tanya, would not even take an ibuprofen or an acetaminophen pill while she was pregnant with our 3 kids. She just didn't want to put anything that was even potentially influential into her bloodstream during those 3 pregnancies. Now, does an ingested aspirin lead to homosexuality? Hardly. But we need to remind ourselves that we are affected by what occurs to and around us during pregnancy, during gestation. So there's intrauterine, prenatal effects. Secondly, there are extrauterine, postnatal effects. These involve things like trauma, viruses suffered by the baby, stress in the home, and it just follows that, again, we're shaped by what happens to and around us. And babies are touched and shaped by their surroundings. Like I need to say such a thing, right? But apparently we need to say such things. My own son, when he was only a few months old, he would fall asleep during college basketball games. My wife and I went to the games, we'd take him with us, and the noise level in the college gymnasium was so loud that his autoimmune response was to go to sleep. While we are infants, we are affected and shaped by what happens to and around us. Does a loud gymnasium lead to homosexuality? Hardly. But trauma and viruses and stress in the home can affect the way that we are being shaped early on in our own lives. And again, I want to remind us that we are affected by what occurs to and around us during our infancy. So things revolving around the baby, prenatal, postnatal. Third, these are the more important factors, are familial factors. And psychiatrists say these are actually far more important for tracing, going backward and tracing homosexuality again than those natal factors. And the first among these are same-sex relationships. So, for example, between a father and a son, between a mother and her daughter. But the father-son is the most important one because men are more likely to be gay than women. And I'll kind of echo what the Daily Beast had said. There's far more scientific data available concerning male homosexuality than female sexuality or transgendered, right? Female homosexuality, for its part, tends to be far more monogamous, far more committed than male homosexuality. Man, I have long, deep theories about why that is, but women just tend to commit more honestly, commit more authentically than men. You can chew through that one, but the homosexual rates, I think, probably correspond to the heterosexual rates of sexuality and sexual promiscuity. Now, back to the same-sex relationships in the family. They can be too intimate, where they're overly given to physical touch, or inappropriate touch, so that some sort of response is built or layered. Or these same-sex familial relationships can be distant, lacking, bent, or twisted, such that in a different way than too much unhealthy contact, however we would define that, could be. But a response to sexuality is nevertheless shaped and built. So it can be on the positive side or the negative side of the ledger, and already we can see how elusive and hard to measure that would be. Same-sex relationships. There are intersex relationships. Father, daughter, mother, son. One possible dynamic is that the fear or distrust of or anxiety caused by the opposite sex parent is transferred to all people of that sex. You can think that one through in the possibilities of formation there or influence. But intersex relationships are influential. Very important is C here among familial factors, which is parental separation. Now look, folks, we know from some 50 years of scientific studies that we are profoundly shaped by our parents. For my part, I believe God designed it to occur precisely that way. He meant for a man and a woman to bear and raise children, and oh my goodness, more and more studies are showing that the single greatest factor for success in life, if we define that by monetary income earned or addictions not suffered or the education level attained or incarceration not endured, the single greatest factor is having a two-parent dad and mom home in which to grow up. Now, of course, not having a dad and mom doesn't mean one is fated to poverty or prison or lack of education, but having that gift of a mom and a dad is an enormous factor for several measures of blessing in life. And again, sorry to detour here for a moment. I do believe being a parent is the single most important thing anyone, married or separated, divorced or single, it's the most important thing a person will ever do, can ever do. Because parents raise children, and when you amass enough children together, you have a new generation, and new generations make for society. So parenting, then, has a direct influence upon the shape of society. Well, parental separation. When the parents separate or divorce, especially when we're little, before we're adults, the effect of that can be great upon us. Does every person whose parents separated or divorced become homosexual? Hardly. The divorce rate is so high that if it were a one-for-one cause, goodness knows how much higher the societal homosexual rate would be. Nevertheless, we are indeed shaped by our parents' relationship, or the lack of it, right? And let's be obvious. That relationship also greatly shapes heterosexuality and helps to account for promiscuity and the like. Kids of divorced parents are themselves more likely to divorce. Lord have mercy, said the man whose parents divorced. But parental separation can be big, have a big effect upon us. Still another, parental influence. Time spent with the child, acceptance of the child, or yelling, hitting, abuse of the child. Those kinds of things can contribute to a longing for a parent that can manifest in relationship with same-sex peers. A child might turn to a sibling for love, nurture, or intimacy or touch when a parent is distant or angry or abusive. Or even if a parent is glomming, overbearing, ever present. And it turns out that quantity time is actually as important for our formation as quality time. I haven't been hearing that phrase quality time so much like I did in former years, but the fact is we are shaped by the people, the parents who raise us. We're shaped by how much time we spend around other people, how much time we spend around our parents. I've always wondered how much of my love of the English language is the result of growing up with a mom who was an English major. She, Valerie, was shaping me even when I was an infant by talking to me with adult four-syllable words, Jerry, four-syllable. Well, our brains are shaped by that relationship. We become our brains, as I'm going to say more carefully below. So parental influence obviously is huge. E, under familial factors, sexual abuse. Do I need to delineate this one for long? We are shaped by sexual touch and abuse. Those kinds of things can bend or wrench or pull our own sexuality in different directions. God designed us such that when we are touched in our genitalia, we ourselves are touched. It's no wonder, no surprise, He put so many boundaries around that kind of touch. He meant for it to be powerful, but He meant for it to be practiced, felt, experienced within the safety, the commitment, the covenant of marriage. Does everyone who is touched in their genitalia at a young or prepubescent age become homosexual? Hardly. But that kind of touch abuse can shape predilections and tendencies and affections that can develop and grow and take on more force over time. Again, why does the Bible go on in both the Old and New Testaments about human sexuality? I believe it's because God knew what a powerful effect sexuality has both upon us and then by extension the formation of society. Another factor here, another contributing factor for homosexuality is rejection by same-sex peers. Persons may find themselves more greatly wanting the friendship, emotional, and physical contact with those who are rejecting them, or it may move them away. Maybe for children who do not have a two-parent male-female home in which to grow, this is a greater factor? I don't know. That would be my first intuition. And then lastly, I want to note by way of contributing factor, society. We need to note society because the cumulative effect of society greatly shapes people. Every one of you listening to me today speaks English because you were educated by English literate people. Even more, those English literate folks positively wanted you to be literate in English. It's not an accident that you're fluent in English. Well, we could list off a long chain of other features about life that have also shaped your identity. That you think it's normal to drive on the right side of the road. Your belief in a fair price at the market. Your belief that we're all equal under the law. Your expectation to be treated with dignity by strangers. Your appreciation for the specific music you listen to. The very kind of food you enjoy and want. Society shapes us. It always has and it always will. We Christians are called by Jesus to be both salt and light, or both harmless as doves and clever as serpents, concerning the values of this age, an age steadily turning away from the Judeo-Christian tradition. You've heard of Gallup poll. It's a widely trusted polling agency. Gallup poll noted in January of 2017 that, quote, the portion of American adults identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender increased to 4.1% in 2016 from 3.5% in 2012. So over a 4-year period, the percentage went up 0.6. The Gallup poll went on, quote, "These figures, drawn from the largest representative sample of LGBT Americans collected in the U.S., imply that more than an estimated 10 million adults now identify as LGBT in the U.S. today. Approximately 1.75 million more compared with 2012. And, Gallup went on, millennials, defined here as those born between 1980 and 1998, drive virtually all of the increases observed in an overall LGBT self-identification. Millennials are more than twice as likely as any other generation to identify as LGBT." End quote. That's not me coming up with those stats or that language. That's the Gallup poll. Well, I believe it makes sense that as society both accepts and celebrates homosexual identity, that homosexual rates will increase further. It's not just that television shows, most notably Will and Grace, and movies promote homosexual identity. It is that our education system is steadily promoting homosexual identity. Think again of the formation of prepubescents and young adolescents. They are being run through, honestly, I'm sorry, but it's the truth, an indoctrination program that promotes homosexual identity. It's willful and it's planned. Today, to say anything against homosexuality, or now with it transgenderism, even to ask questions, is deemed positively hateful. And that the rhetoric is so hot, I believe, goes significantly toward this becoming a spiritual issue. It's kind of a principality and a power at work in our era. And since there's no genetic cause, no specific gene or combination of genes that accounts for the rise of homosexuality, is there another factor that makes more sense than the fabric of society? Since, as the Gallup poll noted above, millennials are the most gay generation in U.S. history, do we believe that there's some genetic shift occurring within the population? Well, hardly. No. The rise is a one-for-one with the societal shift with regard to homosexuality. Society is very influential. I want to think next with you about brain formation. So there are some contributing factors. But I want to think next with you about brain formation, because I believe this is very important for our thinking about all kinds of dynamics, all kinds of ways of being human. I need to say first, I can't and won't here explain my whole theoanthropological understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be us. But briefly, I do not believe we are only brains. That we are only brains is a growing position among materialists. But we are not only our brain. We are decidedly our brain, but we're not only our brain. But what I do believe is true is that how our brains get shaped is central to how we get shaped. So brain formation is an important element for understanding human formation. And I suppose eventually we could even extend this line of thought into pedagogy, or parenting, or even making disciples. So, some things about brain formation. More and more studies are showing that homosexual activity is an addiction not unlike alcoholism or drugs. Like alcohol and drugs, homosexual activity can have a strong hold upon our bodies and brains. We all know that certain behaviors, including heterosexual promiscuity and adultery, can be at first compulsive, then habitual, and finally addictive. And the gay lifestyle can be very hard to break free from because gay behavior, especially for men, is very compelling and compulsive. Compulsions again develop into habits. Habits shape one's identity because repetition alters the brain itself. Our brains are like the hardware, and the mind is the software that is developed over time inside our hardware through repetition. And the way it works concerns the neocortex. If you're still listening, this is a bit technical, but I find it fascinating for many reasons, let alone homosexuality. The neocortex is the seat of the will. The cortex, one psychiatrist writes, the cortex is arranged in large clusters of densely interconnected neurons. The neurons of the neocortex are strengthened over time while others are eliminated altogether. Eventually, such neurological firings actually shape the brain's tissue, with the result that choices are easier or harder to make based on the shape of the tissue. The tissue in these areas actually increases. This makes sense regarding children learning languages, or most any other thing, at a more rapid rate than adults. The tissues haven't yet set. They aren't set in their ways yet. While actions of the lower levels of the brain are more hardwired, the brainstem regulates heartbeat, breathing, swallowing, blood pressure, and while actions of the lower levels of the brain are more hardwired, the neocortex is more flexible, more dynamic. End quote. So these formulations, the shaping of tissue, the firing of energy, the building of patterns in little human selves continues on into adolescence and may be influenced dramatically by hormones. Old patterns wired in our brain are hard to eliminate. And so when those habits become compulsions, become addictions, we're not just fighting a pattern of behavior, we're fighting a pattern, we're dealing with a pattern of neurological brain firing that is going on. And these patterns, it hardly needs to be said, can become compulsive. Now again, here's me thinking as a theologian. Even in our brain's development, we are simultaneously imago Dei, created in the image of God, and fallen sinners. Even Christians are sinners being saved by grace, or what Martin Luther called simul justus et peccator, at once righteous and sinful. So we're all dealing with these patterns in our brain, some of them more appropriately ordered and others that aren't, some of them more full of grace and others of them more sinful. And even with just that little bit noted, I think we need to be slow to cast stones at others. Christians or not, our brains enjoy doing both upright and sinful things, and our brains don't always know the difference between sin and virtue. And oh my gosh, there's just so much to be said there about the formation of the conscience and the necessity of morality and so forth and so on, right? But there's more. Still deeper, the compulsions we experience, psychiatrists say, are linked to primitive impulses, biological urges. The most pleasurable of biological urges is the sexual drive. Scientists say that orgasm releases opioids into the body, so that repeated sexual behaviors are especially strongly reinforced and can even overpower the will. And again, we say all this to note that compulsions are frequently difficult to break or redirect. But the point here is that sexual orgasm is pleasurable to both body and brain. The opioids that course through the human body in orgasm course through the human brain as well. That pleasurable feeling can be associated with actions like gambling or winning in sports or catching a big salmon on a fishing rod. We could make a long list of things that can actually release opioids in our body. But when we link the pleasure of opioids coursing through ourselves to relationships, it's not difficult to imagine how those relationships themselves can be seen as the cause of that joy, pleasure, and even euphoria. And again, I believe that God built us with the capacity to feel all of that, but God wanted that to be linked up properly in properly bounded, properly defined ways. So sexual orgasm can be addictive, and please hear me carefully. I'm not saying that all homosexual activity or fondness is orgasmic. What I'm trying to do is delineate, tease out the complicated dynamics at work in human behavior and affections, the processes of why we like what we do. Well, homosexuality is something that, even apart from sexual orgasm, can become normal, natural, or even pleasurable to the self, to the brain, to the person. But there are norms and pleasures that God prohibits in the Bible. Christians need to understand both what is at work in human formation, as complex as it is, and that God has bounded aims for we, His creation. So there are contributing factors at work. There's brain formation that's work, and it shows again how amazing we are, how sophisticated we are, and how we become in some ways our actions. And I want to conclude again by saying that, and because it's so important for the Christian subculture and our attitudes, I want to say again that the aforementioned contributing factors are not necessitators. They do not force anyone to become homosexual. A person could endure or undergo any one of those, or a combination of them all, and not end up being a practicing homosexual. Statistically, we all endure troubles and problems in life, but the overwhelming percentage of the population, Gallup poll puts it at 96%, is heterosexual. What we need to understand, however, is that on the one hand, the overwhelming preponderance of homosexuals did not choose to be homosexual. On the other hand, it's very unlikely that they were homosexual at birth. They may indeed remember themselves always having been homosexual, but that is still different from being born one. Our memories shape our prior experience, even if those memories aren't perfect. Now, it is true that some today choose homosexuality, and maybe that's done to be different, or to shock their parents, or provoke their peers, or to solicit a reaction out of people. And I think due to the influence of the media, pop culture, and the public school system, that homosexuality is more warranted by society than ever. So it is being normativized by society, even if it never had been before in Western history. But still, most do not choose homosexuality. They find themselves having a homoerotic attraction. They find themselves more comfortable around members of the same sex. It is a subtle but real psychological process, however explained, that brought them into their current state. And how we talk about all of that matters to how we ourselves will be experienced, to how we ourselves will be received when we try to speak with truth and grace. Excuse me. And then finally, that some people, through life circumstances, find themselves to be homosexually oriented is still different from saying that homosexuality is warranted or accepted under a biblical worldview. And I hear too many Christians living today, and they're influenced by the standards of postmodernism, secularism, instead of by Christianity. The biblical ideal is heterosexuality, and specifically intercourse within a heterosexual marriage. And by that latter covenant, God meant both to shape individual persons and society. Thanks for listening. I trust this was informative, and I hope it helps us to live and act with both grace and truth. In my next episode, I'm going to speak to pastoral matters. How do we treat our homosexual friends and family? What are some practical and pastoral questions, hard as they are to think about or ask aloud? What are the kinds of things that maybe we Christians need to think through with grace? So thanks again for listening today. Turn your brains on, everybody.